How's my favorite class today? Today, boys and girls, we're going to continue our journey into understanding sociology. We've already covered in the last lesson, we've covered culture. We said cultures are composed, or cultures are measured or compared by sociologists from regions to regions. They are compared using symbols, language, values, norms, religions, which we're going to cover as an entirely separate component in this course, and now, of course, technology. Technology is becoming a component of socialization in relation to culture. So the culture that we're going to talk about here a little bit today, or I'm going to give you an introduction on, is called a culture of compliance. And a culture of compliance has been one of the predominant cultural types all throughout the development of human history. A culture of compliance basically is derived from a hierarchical pyramid. There's someone at the top, and those at the top are a very small, minute minority. And as you go down the pyramid, at the very bottom would be people like us. Okay, so it's a culture of compliance is a culture of hierarchy. Probably a better descriptor rather than a pyramid would be something like this, more of a swooped pyramid. How can I describe it? Well, symbols. Symbols, as we've already discussed, or you've seen in previous videos, and I've talked about in class a little bit before our break, and I believe it was in the last video, a symbol is something that represents something meaningful in a culture. And in a culture of compliance, symbols generally are set up to show either a compliance to a hierarchical power or to show the superiority of a deity or leader or what have you, like Chairman Mao in China or Hitler in Europe or Stalin in Russia. They're extreme versions of a culture of compliance. Extreme versions. I think more relaxed versions that we're going to talk about, more modern versions, would perhaps be Korea's. Symbols, as we've covered already in the other videos and in the information we discussed before the Christmas break, symbols are something that represents something meaningful in a culture. Okay, cultures couldn't exist without symbols. There's lots of symbolism inside of cultures. In a culture of compliance, generally the symbolism points towards those at the top being very good, or those at the bottom being very compliant in a culture of compliance. Language is a tool that allows us to express our symbols, to show to others what we believe. They are immersed they're intertwined in a lattice work that encompasses race and religion and ethnicity and gender. They're all entwined inside the lattice work of language. Language in a culture of compliance is very controlled. I used the example in your notes of mitigated speech. Mitigated speech is when you have something to say, but you don't come just right out and say it. You mitigate it. You control what you're saying. For example, if I was going to ask my boss for Friday afternoon off, if I was in an environment where I could speak freely with my boss, where there was free speech, I could say, listen, I need Friday afternoon off. My son has a ball game, and I'm going to attend my son's ball game. If I am in a culture where mitigated speech is a requirement, for example, in a culture of compliance that we're talking about, I would start on Monday. Sir, if it's not too much trouble, I'd like a word with you whenever you're free. And then when my boss comes to see me, I would say, sir, if it's not too much trouble, I could work extra time for you. And I think that would help the business / institution that you're in. and I would do that for this institution. And then the next time you meet, you would say, sir, if it's not too much trouble, I have a dire appointment that requires that I be absent on Friday afternoon for a very small amount of time, but I will make that time up, sir, if that's entirely possible. And I leave that at your discretion. Thank you very much for your time. That would be the example of an interaction using mitigated speech. In my classroom, I'm not sure if I pointed out to you guys or not, but I have a quote from Barack Obama and hangs on my wall, and the quote is part of his address to the UN in 2019. In 2019, when he addressed the UN, the focus of his speech was on freedom of speech. And he again instilled the importance of freedom of speech. In about that time frame, there started to develop a component of American society that were starting to oppose freedom of speech, and he feels, or at least he addressed the UN stating his concern about the degradation of free speech. And the quote was, I believe this is the quote, if I recall, efforts to restrict speech, oppress minorities, and they silence critics. The answer to hate speech is not to repress speech, it is more speech. That is what is required. And I feel that's a very profound thing to say, coming from a political leader. Like, I'm sure it would be easier for Barack Obama, or would have been easier during his presidency, if people were not allowed, if his subjects were not allowed to say, or his voters were not allowed to say what they think. However, he knew down deep that that would not promote a decent society. And the Western world today, although it seems that we have many critics, we have progressed to the point where, not stating that we don't have issues to deal with, but we're at the apex of any society that's ever lived in the history of history. We're doing pretty good. And free speech is a big component part to getting us there. It was a big component part to getting us there. So, another component we use in sociology to differentiate between cultures is values. What cultures' values? Cultural values are usually the yin and yang of cultures. They're the balance, the good and the bad, the light and the dark, the good and evil. Usually that's how they're composed. They typically come in pairs, like, for example, hardworking or lazy. They're an example of what we consider values in a culture. In our culture, in a culture of compliance, typically values are formulated in such a manner as to support those at the top and keep them at the top, and to keep those at the bottom. Norms are another method sociologists use to differentiate amongst cultures. Norms are simply established rules of behaviors. If you follow the social norms within your class, within your group, well, you stay within the confines of that group. You stay in amongst that particular class or structural group. In a culture of compliance, the norms are generally set up to keep the hierarchical structure alive. It's great to learn about different cultures. It's great to get an overview of different cultures and to be able to evaluate cultures using symbols, language, values, norms, well, religion and technology now. And you've learned a little bit about a culture of compliance, and that's good. But what's even better is to learn about how it relates to us. And the best methodology, or the best example I can use in relating how a culture of compliance relates to us, or balances against the culture, the Canadian culture, I found in a book written by a famous Canadian author named Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell is a well-known author. He's published many books that have made the top 10 in the Western world. He's also an editor, or was an editor for a time with the New York Times. I'm not sure if he still is. In one of his books called Outliers, he had a good look at culture. And he looked at various cultures around the world. Well, he looked at a culture of honor, which is our next lesson. And he also looked at culture of compliance. And the area he chose specifically to look at that's immersed in a culture of compliance is Korea. And the component of Korean society that he looked at was their airlines. And it turned out Korean Airlines, before Malcolm Gladwell had started to look into them, had the worst safety record of any airlines in the world. It was so bad that the entity that controls aircraft flight over our heads in Canada, Aviation Canada, they had decided that they were going to pull their license, Korean Air's license, to fly in Canadian airspace. They just didn't want Korean planes in our airspace. They were dropping in the sky. Like, there was an astronomical number of crashes in relation to every other airline. And teams of experts were brought in, specifically from an aviation authority in the United States, to investigate the causes of this, because the United States was considering banning Korean Air from flying in the United States as well. And what they discovered was culture was the culprit. It had nothing to do with the airplanes. It had nothing to do with loss of fuel. It had nothing to do with bad equipment, failures of computers, personnel, inadequate personnel. It had nothing to do with any of that. Their crash record was based solely upon the culture inside of the cockpit of Korean Airlines. Korean Airlines, the culture inside of the cockpit mimicked Korean society, in which a superior makes a decision. It cannot be discussed by inferiors or subordinates. For example, if a Korean Air captain made a mistake and he put the wrong coordinates into a plane and he flew the plane into a mountain, the co-pilot and or the engineer might be in the same plane and would die, rather than correct the captain, because the captain is the superior entity in the plane. And I know you guys are looking at this and say, yeah, well, sir, that would probably never happen. Well, actually, that did happen in Guam. Korean Air flew into the side of a mountain, and the co-pilot and the engineer both knew that it was going to happen, and they just sat back and didn't say anything. And the pilot made a mistake, made an error, but because he was the pilot, the other officers in the Korean airline wouldn't say anything. And those are the concerns, that is where a culture of compliance can take us. I guess that's why I'm so pro-democracy, as I see examples like that. Anyway, I hope that's a good summation of a culture of compliance for you guys. If you have any questions on a culture of compliance, send me an email and I'll give you a phone call. We'll work on it. Have a good day.